Good morning, everyone. I wish to thank the ALIAS network and the scientific and the professional committee for this invitation. The purpose of my talk is to present the case of Linate disaster and to analyze it through an organizational approach that goes beyond the idea, the reductive idea of human error. On 8 October 2001, two airplanes collided at Linate Airport, causing the death of 118 people. The main cause of this accident was a runway incursion. The Raider plane, a Cessna plane, mistook the right taxiway. Instead of taking the taxiway R5, it took the wrong taxiway R6 and crossed the main runway, while the SAS airplane, the blue aircraft, was taking off. After the Tenerife disaster in 1977, where 580 people were killed, this is the most serious ground accident in air transport history. Let's begin with the dynamic of the accident. The SAS airplane, the blue aircraft, was clear to taxi for takeoff. At approximately the same time, a small airplane, a Cessna airplane, was clear to taxi from a general aviation ramp via taxiway R5 to this way. The green line, following the green line. The weather report was a heavy fog with a low visibility between 50 and 100 meters. After receiving clearance from the control tower, the Cessna moved to the intersection between the two taxi lines, R5 and R6, R5 on the left and R6 on the right. And here is where the first mistake took place. As you can see, both markings were deteriorated and their formats did not comply with the international standards, with the ICAO standards. But the visibility condition, these were the visibility conditions that day, and at the same time, the lights of taxiway R6 weren't turned on, they should have been off. Continuing along taxiway R6, the pilots of the Cessna came to the marking Sierra 4, painted on taxiway R6, only on taxiway R6, and oriented to opposite to the aircraft movement direction. And pilots said, Delta Victor X-ray, this is the name of the Cessna, approaching Sierra 4. In the readback, the ground controller said, Delta Victor X-ray, confirm your position. He didn't understand what they said, what the Cessna pilots said. And the pilots replied, approaching the runway, and for the second time, Sierra 4. After a few seconds, the ground controller replied, okay, Roger, maintain the stop bar, I'll call you back. Roger, all position. The pilots communicated the two important items of information, approaching the runway and Sierra 4. Approaching the runway, taxiway R5 does not approach the main runway, Taxiway R6 approaches the runway. And the Sierra 4 is a marking written only on taxiway R6. But the communication did not break the controller conviction. He still believed that the Cessna was on the right taxiway R5 on the left. So the Cessna arrived at the stop bar of taxiway R6, and the ground controller said, Delta Victor X-ray, continue your taxi on main apron, follow the alpha line. The ground controller was thinking that the Cessna was at the stop bar of taxiway R6 at this point, and so he said, continue your taxi on main apron, this is the main parking area, follow the alpha line. And this is very hard to believe. In the readback, the pilots replied, Roger, continue the taxi main apron, alpha line. But it's very difficult to believe because this means that after crossing the main runway, they would go on the left to the parking area and the north on the right for takeoff. And after this last and the ground controller said that it's correct and please call me back entering the main taxiway. And finally, pilots said, I'll call you on the main taxiway. And this was the last communication before the accident. After this, pilots entered the main runway without prescribed clearance, without specific clearance, and this was a very relevant violation, and the disaster was now inevitable. After a few seconds, there was a collision between the two airplanes. This is the accident point on the left, the end of taxiway R6, and this is the R2 entrance. Okay. Why? Who is to blame? Was it a mistake of Cessna pilots? Was it an error of a ground controller? Was caused by inadequate signal conditions, the absence of a ground radar, or was it a tragic fatality? The accident dynamics seems clear. The Cessna mistook the taxiway and entered the main runway without specific clearance. If the pilots had taken the right taxiway, this accident would not have happened. And at the same time, the controller did not realize where the Cessna was. But I think, and I'm not alone in this, that this perspective is very reductive. The error of a human error approach is that it assumes that the source of failure is a human error, and it analyzes events to find where a person is involved, and it stops analysis when one person is found. But this is a very reductive approach because it is much easier to pin the responsibility for an accident on the unsafe acts of those people at the sharp end. And this is a fundamental attribution error. Fundamental attribution error is the belief that bad acts are committed by bad people. I think we can analyze this accident using this model based on 3 error levels. The individual level consists of errors, violations, mistakes, bad decisions made by people at the sharp end, such as controller and system pilots. The organizational level, weaknesses, defenses, managerial decisions, error-inducing conditions, and latent conditions. And the inter-organizational level consisted of the main organizations involved in regulation and management of Linate airdrome. Failures at the individual level triggered the accident, breaking down the defenses, but they were made possible by failures at organizational and inter-organizational level. So let's go to see the individual level and the other level. Of course, human error did occur. The Cessna and 2 pilots were not qualified and certified to operate in low visibility conditions, such as that day, and nobody stopped them, nobody sanctioned pilots. The Cessna crew took the wrong taxiway, and this was an error, probably a slip, an involuntary error, and entered the runway without specific clearance, and this was a very relevant violation. And there were some misunderstanding communication between pilots and the ground controller. But it's important to remember that the controller was handling 11 aircraft for 126 radio communications in only 60 minutes. In these conditions, the ground controller, the workload of a ground controller was high demanding. In these conditions, in these stressful conditions, controller is more likely to be victim of the confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency of people to favor information that confirm their expectation. But not only human error, individual level, individual failures. The failures of the actors were embedded in a context characterized by several latent flaws and critical error-inducing conditions. For example, failure defenses. There was no ground radar. The stalled equipment for prevention runway incursion at R6 intersection was deactivated. The stop bars and tower lights were not controllable by air traffic controller. Error-inducing conditions, the ground marking were not clearly visible, signs, signals, and the lights were inadequate and misleading. Latent failures, no learning from near miss. The day before, there was another relevant runway incursion, but the controller was able to stop pilots to avoid accident. And these latent conditions existed prior to the accident, and they originated from organizational and managerial failures present in the broader system. And finally, the last level, the inter-organizational level, the bigger picture in Linate. The management operational system at Linate Aerodrome was complicated and involved 3 organizations: Air Traffic Regulator, ENAV, Airport Authority, ENAC, and service provider, SEA. No effective performance agreements existed among these organizations regarding safety. The lack of coordination among these actors, among these 3 organizations in relation to flight safety, lead to the creation over time of numerous latent flaws and error-inducing conditions and organizational weaknesses. For example, the meetings about safety among these organizations were called rarely and often on matters different than air safety. So we can say that human error is a consequence, not a cause. Is a symptom that reveal the presence of latent conditions in the system at large. For example, the Cessna crew took the wrong taxiway and entered the runway without specific clearance. This human error was made possible, of course not caused by, but made possible by many different organizational and inter-organizational contributing factors, such as marking and the signs were not in accordance with ICAO standards, red bars and the tower lights were not controllable by air traffic controller, and so. The communication misunderstanding failures, for example, between pilots and the control tower was made possible by the absence of ground radar, the installed equipment for prevention runway incursion was deactivated, the marking and the signs were not in accordance with the ICAO standard, etc., etc. So many latent conditions. And we can say that human errors at individual level are constructed by failures in the organizational and inter-organizational level. Individual level is embedded in organizational and inter-organizational level. This is not only a scientific or academic considerations, but is a very relevant importance achievement because if you want to change the system, if you want to improve safety, reliability, and the resilience of this system, you have to change the organizational and the inter-organizational level. So, this led me to my next point. Active failures at the sharp end open gaps in the defenses, latent systemic pathogens resulting in gaps and absence in the defenses, and together they opened a brief window of opportunity for the accident to occur. Conclusion. Linate disaster had all the hallmarks of an organizational accident. This was an organizational accident. If we focus too closely upon the unsafe acts at the sharp end, we are in danger of missing the fact that this was the result of an organizational error. It's important to take a system perspective. The Linate accident was not determined by a single cause, but by a complex combination of many different contributing factors all linked together. Communication and organization problems of many kinds were crucial factors in this and other disasters. In this case, show how it is difficult for the legal and the justice system to determine responsibilities. Delegating it to the justice system to solve the problem does not help the system to advance and does not facilitate the organizational learning and improve safety conditions. And now, I want to discuss 2 different ways of looking at accident in organizations. In more general terms, we should distinguish 2 different logics, 2 different ways of looking at errors and accident in organizations. According to individual blame the individual blame logic and the organizational function logic. According to individual blame logic, error and accidents are caused by negligence of people working at the sharp end. The individual blame logic is a type of approach which tries to identify guilty individuals. It is typical of criminal law, but it is also prevalent in organizations based on a punitive culture. Within this approach, the proposed solutions are mainly disciplinary and the organizational context is overlooked. Instead, for the organizational function logic, accidented errors are organizationally and socially constructed. Reducing accident to the individual error, to human failures, is an error. and means that the systems remain the same. The aim of this approach of organizational function logic is to identify the organizational factors that may reduce the possibility of an accident to occur. To summarize, we can say that individual blame logic is backward-looking and retributive. Instead, organizational function logic is forward-looking and change-oriented. Let's move on to the advantages and the disadvantages of each one. The problem of individual blame logic is that it produces a vicious circle. The search for the guilty induces individuals to hide errors, the organizational inertia, and defensive behavior. Individual blame logic leads to defensive posturing, obfuscation of information, and the silent reporting system. And this is a very big problem because reporting is critical for learning, and the learning is critical for constantly improving safety. One example of this vicious circle is taken from another sector that I think we will discuss tomorrow, of the healthcare system. And is the problem of the defensive medicine. What's defensive medicine? Defensive medicine takes place when healthcare personnel prescribe unnecessary treatments or avoid high-risk procedures with the goal of reducing their exposure to malpractice litigation. When doctors prescribe unnecessary tests, procedures, or specialist visits, they are doing positive defensive medicine. When doctors avoid high-risk patients or procedures, they are doing negative defensive medicine. But it's important to remember that the positive defensive medicine does not mean good medicine, because in this case, they are wasting important resources and they are increasing the risk for patients with an excess of X-rays or biopsy and so on. This is not a new phenomenon. I think it's very important for our reflection, for our considerations. And Tancredi in 1978 found out that about 70% of people, of doctors, practice this behavior, this defensive behavior, and similar results emerged from studies conducted in many different countries. We conducted similar research in our countries, and we studied the surgeons' populations, and we found out that about 78% of doctors, of surgeons, practice defensive behavior. For example, they recur to unnecessary hospitalizations, they wrote unnecessary notes in patients' record, they prescribe unnecessary drugs, unnecessary refer to specialists, etc. The last two issues are related to negative defensive medicine. As you can see, about 26%, more than 26% of people interviewed said that they had excluded from certain treatments patients subject to risk. We believe that these data are underestimated because when doctors say this, they are declaring legal procedures and they admit something of illegal. But what were the main reasons for this defensive behavior? The main reasons are fear of medical legal litigation, colleagues' experience of legal litigation, fear of request for compensation, and personal experience of medical legal litigation. We can conclude that the side effects of defensive medicine, there are a lot of side effects. The threats of legal investigation does not make the medical system more careful and attentive towards the patients. And individual blame logic, the blame culture does not improve patient safety. The, judicial proceedings or their possibility can create a climate of fear, making people reluctant to share information. One positive case of the organizational functional logic, one consequence of organizational functional logic is the virtuous circle. A system approach favors the errors reporting in order to remove the latent critical factors. The result is organizational learning and the progressive reduction of risk in organization. One example of this virtuous circle is the Italian Air Force. Oh, before this, it's important to get the balance right, it's important to get the balance right between the person model and the system model, the proximal factors and the remote factors, because widening the search for error shaping factors has brought about great benefits in understanding accidents. But moving from proximal factors to remote factors, one person can say it's not my fault, it's the system, and of course it's completely wrong. This is completely wrong. It's important to get the balance right between individual and organizational responsibility and accountability, because both extremes have their pitfalls. And the solution is a just culture. Just culture is the middle ground between a blame-free culture, which attributes all errors to the system, and says no individuals is to be held accountable, and overly punitive culture where individuals are blamed for all mistakes. But it's fundamental to draw the line between acceptable behavior and unacceptable behavior. From acceptable behavior, which usually constitutes the major part of the actions, and unacceptable behavior, only the latter should be blamed. Because equating a blame-free system to an absence of personal accountability is wrong. A no-blame culture is neither feasible nor desirable. An organization in which everybody can get away with everything is an organization that loses credibility to the eyes of its member. So it's important that some acts, unsafe acts, deserve sanctions. A just culture is meant to balance between learning from incident with accountability for their consequences. In a just culture, staff can differentiate between acceptable and unacceptable acts, for example, human error and some types of at-risk behavior, and reckless behavior and malicious behavior. The first one should not be blamed because they are unintentional. The second one, of course, yes, because they are deliberate and they should be blamed. But the real question, the operational question, is who can draw the line? Who has the power? Who has the authority to draw the line? One positive case is the case of Italian Air Force. Since 1991, the Italian Air Force has developed a new organizational model for risk management based on a new safety culture, a different safety culture. This followed a major accident in which a military plane crashed into a school and killed 12 people. This was a very serious problem for this organization and for the image of this organization. The new risk management was based on the principle of a just culture, and these were some of these principles. The promotion of a new vision of risk management and safety, the promotion of methods for identification, analysis, and prevention risk, the creation of a database for incident reporting, but the implementation of a just culture whereby pilots were not punished for involuntary errors, omissions, slips, but only for serious negligence, gross violations, and indiscipline. At the same time, there was a shift in a strategy from the deterrent strategy to compliance strategy. Deterrent strategy is typical of a blame culture, of a blame organization, is backward-looking, and is implemented after the accident happens. And the goal is to identify a person that is found guilty for this. And a compliance strategy is forward-looking, and the main goal is to identify the near miss to avoid accident. The compliance strategy is based on a shift from a conception of an error as a human failure to the idea that everyone can fail. For example, we are studying this organization. These sentences are taken from interviews with the pilots. One pilot said, for each event we look for the reason why it happens. We do not talk about blame and the responsibility. We do not want to know who the guilty person was, but why the event happened. Another pilot said, error is a mechanism for learning. The more people I inform about my error, the less they risk repeating the error, etc., etc. And let's now go to look at the outcomes of the new safety strategy. This graph shows the instant reporting at Italian Air Force that collects the voluntary reports about near miss and safety problems. In this graph, the red columns report the errors that have to do with human factors, and the blue columns report the total amount of technical, technological, human, and procedural factors. The numbers show the actual amount of problems reported, and as you can see, the number of errors reported has increased dramatically since 1991 due to the progressive diffusion of just culture. And in this way, information became part of systemic knowledge and can be used for local and national safety actions. And as a result, the accidents number has decreased, and at the same time, the death number has dramatically decreased. Finally, I want to conclude saying that there is a very simple but profound choice. Either organizations manage human error by learning from them, or human errors will manage organizations. To achieve the first one is fundamental to develop a just culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I think
Thank you. My name is Mark Baumgartner. I'm with the International Federation of Air Traffic Controllers Association. Thank you very much for the presentation. Two questions for you. In this framework of CESAR and future technology and the legal liability framework. Just culture, yes, we're absolutely fond. We need it. We think it's the way to go. However, we have created so many things in the last 20 years within aviation and in particular air traffic control that we have come to a point where we think we have now found which way to go. That means we have to bridge the gap to the judicial system. Maybe you have also some ideas there, because that is one of the very, very difficult tasks when we talk to prosecutors, to judges, to judicial authorities, that the notion of just culture is not understood, or if it is understood, is being refuted as some sort of protectism for a workforce or for operators. That will be the first question. Do you have anything to share with the audience, or where should research look into it to bridge this gap? We have, from an aviation point of view, just maybe also for the information for the others who are here, we have created, together with Eurocontrol, has put in place a Just Culture task force, and out of that there's now a model policy with some recommendations towards the Minister of Transport to bridge the gap to the Minister of Justice. But that is only starting to be published, so maybe there is a need for more research to assist. Second question, and that joins a little bit what Peter Altman this morning has said about redundancy. With your example in Milan, there's for me one of the most important thing when we talk about future technology is the low visibility procedure without the adequate equipment. So the equipment, according to your slide, was out of the air since 1999. But according to international regulation, no landing and departure should have happened during these meteorological conditions. So if we move towards modern systems or modern type of a new concept of managing air traffic control, how do we cope with the business pressure where it says we cannot close the airports? We know that we, from an operational, from an institutional point of view, we shouldn't be doing what we're doing, but we create some workaround. So maybe also to have few views of you on this challenge we will face, certainly with new technology entering into the operational scene. Thank you very much.
The first one is a very big question, and I am afraid I'm not the right person to give you an answer on this. But I think I totally agree. I think this is a very big problem, and just culture is not a cultural change. It's not a cultural change, but the first one is a judicial change. And this is very difficult, not only for this sector, but at the same time, for example, for another sector, for a healthcare system. And probably Professor Anna Masutti can reply you about this because she's an expert about the different legal system in Europe on this. But the Italian situation, for example, is dramatic because the prevalence of judicial proceeding, the relevance of judicial proceeding is one of the main factors that can stop the reporting, that can stop the learning from errors, and this judicial pressure on air traffic controllers is one of the big problems in Italy for reporting, for learning, and for improve, and for the application and the implementation of a just culture. Regarding the second question, I think the big problem was the tension between the production and the safety, the very difficult tension between production and the safety conditions is true. This is a very big problem, but I think at the same time, in the case of Linate, it was not caused only by the pressure or the meteorological, the weather conditions, but in particular for the absence of any supports for the air traffic controller, because there was no radar and the sign signals and the markings were deteriorated and out of standard, and so I think there was a very socio-technical problems between the human factor, the human, and the absence of a technological supports. So the ground controller was working in a very incredible situation without any type of supports, and without a ground radar, and without the possibility to see the airplanes. And I think this was one of the main contributing factors of this event. Okay.
Other.
Yes, Carlos Jägers from my FATSE again. I hope I don't make myself a nuisance. Two comments first. On the first issue of Linate accident and the absence of ground radar, definitely this, as Mark Baumgartner knows, this is an issue that has been analyzed and reanalyzed by us many times in many different fora, and there was an issue, a system-wide issue, as you very correctly pointed out. There was, in fact, a ground radar, but it had been bought 7 years before, and it was in boxes for 7 years. So for some reason, the system had decided that it was economically more feasible not to install it. The provider of the ground radar is on video saying that he was contacted a few days after the accident to install the system. So definitely the error should be looked for in the system as a whole, and I know it was looked for, and very drastic actions were taken. In terms of the just culture, I have a question and a comment. The question is how you implemented, the just culture was implemented in the Italian Air Force, taking into account that most European countries are subject to the Napoleonic Code in terms of the legal system, and the judge can always remove the protection of the anonymity protection of the reportee. So in one case, which I know of, Denmark, the constitution was amended so that this would be feasible. In terms of a proactive approach, trying to coach the prevalent culture to change, we have a more recent example that shows that this is very difficult, namely the Oberlingen accident. The first reaction was to blame technicians for gross negligence, which was proved subsequently that was not the case. So how do you get around all these issues, and how can we step forward and bridge the gap as Mark Baumgartner correctly addressed?
Of course, the implementation of just culture in Italian force is an ongoing process, but I think they achieved very relevant goals. The Italian force is completely different than the other sectors, than healthcare system or the private air traffic controller, because you can think that Italian force is a closed system and they have internal procedures, and the judges' pressure is not so relevant as in the world of air traffic controller, and this is a very positive aspect that can favor the implementation of a just culture. Of course, when a big accident happened, there is a tension between internal just culture and outside blame culture, of course. But big accidents are very, very low, fortunately, and this important. It's important that just culture favors the error reporting that can reduce this type of a big accident. But when a big accident happened, of course, there is a tension, and not the big tension between the blame culture, outside blame culture, and the internal just culture, and so.